Welcome to our session this morning on Improving Indigenous Superannuation. We've got two great speakers with us today, Nathan Boyle, Senior Analyst from the Indigenous Outreach Program at ASIC, and Lyn Melcer, Head of Technical Advice, QSuper. You may recognise their faces from the Royal Commission hearings. But to get us started this morning, I would like you all to engage in a polling question. So if I could get you to pull out your phones and get into the app. If you could select Room A and then under the polls live Q&A, the question, does your fund keep track of members who fail to provide their ID when calling your contact centre? Anyone not there yet? Need more time? All right, show us the results. I'll make up your mind. I think the telling thing there for me is the unsure number. So 20% of you do keep information on when someone fails their Know Your Customer process. Interesting. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that today. Good to see so many of you interested in this session today. It's an issue that's very, very close to my heart, and obviously Nathan and Lyn's as well. I have been involved with the Indigenous Superannuation Working Group now since 2013. I co-chair that working group, and I wanted to show you, if I could have my slides please, the other members of that group. So if your fund isn't up there and represented, we'd love to hear from you, because improving Indigenous outcomes in superannuation is a whole of industry challenge. And the more people that can get involved, I think, the better. So the working group has been doing a number of different things over the years. Obviously, we bring people together and we talk about shared experiences. We talk about leading practice in this area. We've also put on a number of summits. So in 2015 and 2016, we brought together industry participants, including the regulators, who are a very important part of the solutions in this space. And in 2016, we also brought on board a number of Indigenous community representatives, particularly those working in communities providing financial counselling services to Indigenous members. That was a real eye-opening experience, I think, for the funds in the room. And then last year we had a round table. One of the key achievements, I think, that the working group has been able to do for the industry is to work together with AUSTRAC on a protocol for Indigenous identification. So hence why that polling question was important to us. There is an alternative. AUSTRAC gives guidance in relation to how you can find alternative ways to accept the prove the identification of an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander member, who we know through the work of the working group and the funds, and certainly from information that ASIC has given us over the years, may not have a current driver's licence or a passport or even a birth certificate. Yet they're money from it goes into their superannuation account when they work, and then when it comes to retirement they can't prove that the money is theirs. It's quite an extraordinary fault in our system. So the Royal Commission obviously had a few things to say about Indigenous issues this year. It was an area of focus, but also Indigenous superannuation. So even though this was a Royal Commission into misconduct, There was one positive news story in it, and that was, I guess, the work that QSuper has been doing in relation to improving outcomes for their Indigenous members. And so we're really honoured to have Lyn Melcer here with us today, because she did such a fabulous job at representing not only QSuper, but I think, that attitude of profit to member funds. It's all about the member. It doesn't matter if they're from a remote community, they're Aboriginal, they're black, they're white, or whatever. It doesn't matter. You've got to look after that member. You have a fiduciary responsibility to do so. So Haynes said, as is too often the case with other aspects of financial services, some Australians encounter difficulties gaining access to and making effective use of some aspects of the superannuation system. In particular, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples encounter needless difficulties to do with identification and about binding death nominations. In relation to the banking code, he went on to recommend, if a customer is having difficulty proving his or her identity and tells the bank that he or she identifies as an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person, the bank will follow AUSTRAC's guidance about the identification and verification of persons of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander heritage. In the super part of the report, he says, there is no reason for any entity not to have practices and procedures of these kinds, and there is no reason for any entity not to have trained staff to use them. So while we've done a lot of work in terms of getting the AUSTRAC guidance up, and we may have some support for it at senior levels, has it really filtered down to the people that need to be using it and that have the contact with the member? In terms of binding death nominations, he said, the notion of an interdependency relationship is broad. Lest there be doubt, however, I urge consultation with relevant Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples about whether they, as the relevant users of the system, see difficulties about binding death nominations that should be met. So that's just to set the context for you. We're going to have both Nathan and Lyn do a short presentation, and then we'll get into the meaty Q&A. So please make welcome Nathan Boyle.
Thanks, Eva. And Eva did say a short presentation, and I'm renowned for talking far longer than I'm supposed to. So do forgive me if I read a little bit here just to make sure that I'm keeping on track of time. But before I begin, as a Wiradjuri man whose family connections come from Trangie in central west New South Wales, I'd just like to acknowledge the Yugambeh people who are the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we're sitting today, and thank them for their ongoing custodianship of country. And I think really, to begin the formal part of my speech, I'd like to second ASIC's chairman's regular line, which is that the most important thing to remember when we're talking about reducing barriers to access and increasing knowledge about superannuation for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is that it's their money. As people working in the superannuation industry, you are responsible for safeguarding people's retirement savings, but also for making sure that people are able to access those retirement savings when they do meet a condition of release. So ensuring that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander members are able to access and engage with their superannuation in the same way as all other Australians, the super industry is only meeting their fiduciary obligations. Ensuring that vulnerable members are able to access and engage with their superannuation is not a special measure. It's not about giving Indigenous members more than other members. It's about ensuring equitable access for all. Today, in this introduction, I'll talk about the main policy questions that were raised during the superannuation round of the Royal Commission last year, and ASIC's position in relation to each of them. This introduction will probably raise more questions than answers, but I think that that's important. It's important to recognise that no one has all of the answers in this space, and that improving access and awareness of superannuation amongst vulnerable members, including Indigenous members, is an area where collaboration and sharing the things that have worked and the things that have not worked is the only way to achieve the best outcomes. The Indigenous policy questions that were raised during the super round, which Eva just went through, included the appropriateness of identification procedures used by funds, whether these procedures are sufficiently understood and implemented by customer-facing staff, whether superannuation funds should be required to record whether members identify as Indigenous, whether all superannuation funds should be required to permit the early release of superannuation to their members, whether the lower life expectancy of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people should be taken into account, and whether categories of people permitted by legislation to be the subject of binding death nominations should be expanded to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kinship structures. So firstly, to identification procedures. The inability to prove an individual's identity to the satisfaction of superannuation funds is a key barrier for Indigenous people. For a whole range of reasons, but particularly due to a fear of welfare taking children away, the births of many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were never registered, meaning that some do not have a birth certificate. And that's not, this isn't something that's a historical fact either. Some research that was done in Western Australia in 2016 shows that over 1 in 5 Aboriginal births today in Western Australia are still not being registered, meaning that those people who are born today in Western Australia, about 20% of them don't begin their life with a formal identity. Programs have been run by government to attempt to help people to obtain birth certificates. But this poses challenges too. Because of the lack of documentation that people often have, birth certificates that are issued through these programs often record the date of birth as 1 January or 1 July in the year that the Indigenous person believes they were born, even if the Indigenous person is adamant that they know their actual date of birth. Other issues include the birth certificate being given in a person's traditional name, them being adopted into a non-Indigenous family and obtaining identity documentation in that name before reassuming their traditional identity later in life, which can mean that Aboriginal people can have identity documentations with a number of different names and a number of different dates of birth. An example of this identity verification comes into play, how it comes into play in accessing super, was noticed by members of my team on a trip to LOCKHART River in 2013. I met with a gentleman, and this is the gentleman here, and his name is Normie, N-O-R-M-I-E. He had a birth certificate with his full name, where his date of birth was recorded as 1 January in the year of his birth. He'd also obtained a licence from the local police station. The driver's licence had recorded Normie's actual name, for argument's sake, the 23rd of March in the year that he thought he was born, but his name was recorded as Norman, and that's not his name. When I asked Normie how come the name on his licence was wrong, he told me that he knew it was wrong, and he'd told the police a couple of times that his name was Normie, and they'd told him, Normie's not a real name, your name's Norman, here's your licence. He also had his Centrelink records, which recorded his full name and date of birth accurately, but this meant that across his 3 forms of identification, he had 2 different names and 2 different dates of birth, meaning he was never going to satisfy the identity requirements of his superannuation fund. It was merely a chance visit to LOCKHART River that showed us that Normie and people in his situation were having great difficulty accessing their super. Normie was a QSuper member, so my colleague and myself went back to Sydney and we thought we'd try and invite someone senior from his fund, from QSuper, to meet Normie and to meet others from his community that were in similar situations to see if we could come up with a solution. And that's when Lyn Melcer kindly agreed to come with us. And thanks to QSuper's willingness to examine their identification policies and to utilise the flexibility accorded under the law, Normie was able to access his super. And that's where LOCKHART River is, up on the eastern side of Cape York. But Normie's situation is unfortunately not unique. But Through the efforts of financial counsellors, consumer advocates, ourselves and others bringing stories like this to the attention of the industry and policymakers, a significant improvement has been made since 2013. As Eva said, in 2016, AUSTRAC released updated guidance to the financial services industry about alternative ways that industry participants can identify Indigenous customers who are unable to meet the standard 100-point ID test. These include things like statements by a referee, photographic letters that are written by a community organisation that show who the person is, etc. And the guidance means that theoretically, all Australians should now be capable of proving their identity to a financial services provider. While we're aware that some funds, QSuper, HESTA, Australian Super, and there are certainly others, have specifically considered the identification challenges experienced by their Indigenous members and have taken steps to raise awareness of the alternative identification procedures, it's not clear that this has happened across the industry or that the awareness is sufficiently high that those procedures are understood and used by customer-facing staff. Just before the superannuation round of the Royal Commission, I was in the APY lands, or the Untitled lands, which is on the border of South Australia, the Northern Territory and Western Australia, with a number of superannuation funds and representatives from government departments. And during that visit, we assisted just over 500 Anangu to engage with their super fund. Around half of these people were unable to comply with the standard identification processes of their fund. We were able to assist each person to prove their identity. And for those people who those superannuation funds that didn't have representatives with us on the trip, we were able to do that over the telephone. Some of the experiences that we had were very positive, with us being able to determine a way to identify the consumer during the first call. But this is not always the case, and it really did depend on which telephone representative you got. Making a call to your super fund and being able to prove your identity should not be like entering a lottery. It should just be a simple process. You shouldn't need someone, an expert, to explain the alternative identification procedures available under the AUSTRAC guidance. So there's certainly still work to be done. In ASIC's view, it would be beneficial if financial service providers, including superannuation funds, had escalation procedures in place where a customer has difficulty passing the initial identity authentication process. Such procedures could include escalation to a staff member that has appropriate seniority and understanding of the financial service provider's risk policy under the Know Your Customer test, to be able to provide tailored assistance. This would benefit not just Indigenous people, but any person having difficulty proving their identity to a financial services provider. And you can see that this could also become an issue with the current policy debate around domestic violence access to superannuation, because someone who is a victim of domestic violence is not going to be thinking of collecting their birth certificate and their driver's licence before they escape that harm. Apart from anecdotally, there's no data showing the number of people that fail initial identification procedures with financial service providers. And that was the point of our polling question this morning. We would like all funds and all financial service providers to start recording them instances where people do fail the Know Your Customer test in the first instance, because that will show you whether your fund does have a problem in assessing these alternative guidelines and making sure that anyone who contacts your fund is able to identify themselves. The second area of focus at the Royal Commission was whether funds should be recording whether their members identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people. ASIC does not have a formal position on this, but I will say that in considering whether or not it is useful for your fund to record this data, it's important to recognise that it's important to remember that it's recognised in many fields, including in the delivery of health services and government programs, that ethnicity-related data collection is an important way to detect, measure and improve outcomes for marginalised groups or populations that might be achieving generally lower outcomes than the broader Australian population. If financial service providers decide to keep data on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander status, it could be used to identify where Indigenous people are experiencing poorer outcomes and to identify the reasons for this, to design solutions to address the reasons for poorer outcomes, and to measure the effectiveness of those solutions at improving the outcomes. The Indigenous Superannuation Working Group has noted the importance of data collection in ensuring the superannuation sector addresses the challenges faced by their Indigenous members in their discussion paper that was released in February 2015. The third area of policy discussion, and don't stress even, the rest of my sections are all quite short. My 10 minutes is up. The third area of policy discussion about whether early release of superannuation should be available through all funds. And ASIC's view is that the rules for early access to superannuation are tight and restrictive, and they strike the right balance between the overriding policy objective of compulsory superannuation, that superannuation benefits are preserved to provide income for retirement, and the recognition that certain exceptional circumstances may justify the early release of benefits to a member. We are of the view that early access provisions should be available to members regardless of which fund they belong to, and we'd encourage funds that do not have early access provisions to consider adopting them. The fourth main area of policy discussion raised the question of whether the lower life expectancy of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people should be taken into account in some way. Some have suggested that there should be a lower preservation age for Indigenous people. ASIC thinks that there is a valid argument that the discrepancy in life expectancies should be recognised in some way in the administration of superannuation, but we do not support a reduction in the preservation age for Indigenous members. We think that this may in itself lead to poorer outcomes. This is because the design of the superannuation system, where the total balance of funds is invested, logically means, taking into account differing investment returns, that the greatest growth of a member's superannuation balance happens in the last 10 years of their working life. So if we reduce the preservation age, it would result in Indigenous members not receiving the benefit of the largest growth phase of superannuation. Arguably, a better way of recognising lower life expectancy of Indigenous members would be to broaden the scope of early access provisions to ensure that it's easier for those members who are in poor health in a remote community in particular to obtain the benefit of their superannuation funds at that time. The lower life expectancy of Indigenous members could be recognised in other ways. For example, the documentary requirements to access your superannuation in relation to terminal illness could be broadened to allow trustees to take the life expectancy of a member's cohort into account as a factor that would lean towards making a decision to release those funds. And I'm running short of time, so I will very briefly touch on the last section, which is whether Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kinship structures should be recognised in administering the super system. And all I'll say on this for now is that where other undocumented relationships exist, for example, de facto relationships, the superannuation administration rules allow for a preponderance of evidence to be used to prove that the relationship meets the requirements of an eligible beneficiary. Similar processes could be put in place to recognise the unique kinship structures within Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Nathan. Over to you, Lyn.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Eva and Nathan, and thank you, everybody, for joining us this morning. Let's see how we go here. I'd like to use the next few moments just to share with you some of the experiences and lessons I've learned over the last 4.5 years. I'm going to try and stick to my notes as well, because like Nathan, we could talk about this for hours, and you do want to have lunch sometime. So I'm going to talk about the work we've been doing primarily with people who live in remote communities. But what I'd like you to think about is apart from a couple of things that are a feature of living a long distance from cities, like technology and access to a broad range of basic services, many of the things apply equally to people living in cities and not just to people of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander heritage. I've been in superannuation and public service for a really long time, and when I first joined the Queensland Government, I ended up working for QSuper purely by luck, but my good luck. I think that the industry we all work in is one of the best because it gives us an opportunity to make a real difference to the lives of people, and that's what we're talking about today. And going out to these communities reminded me of that. It all started with the Indigenous Superannuation Working Group, and after that, well, I really actually blame Nathan, and you'll find that's a recurring theme of the morning. So as Nathan said, in 2014 we visited the community in LOCKHART River, and last year we went to the APY lands. I'd like to start by showing, Nathan showed you where they were, I'd like to show you what they're like. This is LOCKHART River. Now, I'm going to get the right and left wrong, but you'll know what I'm talking about. The jetty there, that's how food is brought into Lockhart River when it's the rainy season, because the roads are all blocked off. And the other photo, you can see the plane, that's the plane we flew in on. It's 2.5 hours north of Cairns. And that little area there, that's where we would spend the night cooking our food and going through our papers of the day. So it's really quite lovely. And this is Lockhart River. APY lands. I'm not even going to try and pronounce the Indigenous word that Nathan said before. All those people there, that's the group that went out, about 22 people. I think Nathan said there was, the 4 funds were Australian Super, Prime Super, HESTA, and Super SA. And then we had the Tax Office, ASIC of course, AUSTRAC, Human Services and First Nations Foundation. About 22 people all up. Now the red part you see, that's actually the road into the area. So you can see it is quite remote. Now, and here's some of our meeting areas. A bit of a mixture there between both Lockhart River and the APY lands. Apart from living in areas of awesome natural beauty in some very tough socio-economic conditions, when it came to their superannuation, the people living in these communities had other things in common. They were disconnected from their money. And often this disconnection was caused by no fault of theirs and for no lack of trying. Up front, what I want to say is we helped anyone in the community, anyone we could, not just QSuper members. We saw people in these communities have trouble with the identification issues that Nathan spoke of, getting certificates and then getting them certified by Justice of the Peace. Apart from containing the areas Nathan mentioned, the certificates are often hard to get and relatively expensive when compared to the size of some of the account balances these people had. One lady I met needed a death certificate and had to travel to Cairns to get that. The treating doctor for a gentleman that I was helping in the Lockhart River was a Royal Flying Doctor, and he or she had been into the community the day before and wouldn't be back in for a few extra days, and there's no specialist in town. And he was looking for a TPD payment. Superannuation terms and forms. In the APY lands, we needed the help of an interpreter because we couldn't speak the language, and we found that there was no Indigenous word for superannuation, let alone consolidation, preservation, all those words that we just throw around, let alone we found that there were all different forms. All our funds have different forms for the same event. Maybe as an industry we could get together and come up with a standard form for some of our standard events, like binding death nominations. That would make life a lot simpler. And then there was technology limitations, not just internet access and access to computers, but even modern photocopiers. A man in Lockhart River I was working with came and saw me. I was going to certify his driver's licence photo, and he laughed and he said to me, "No, they don't make photocopies for black fellas." And seriously, this gentleman was really dark and you couldn't see his features through the photocopier. And when we went to the photocopier, it was 30 years old at least. It would have been the first one that came out on the ark, I'm sure. But something that you may notice about these issues is they could apply to anyone at any time. For example, limited technology and trouble providing ID can happen during times of natural disasters like floods or fires and unnatural disasters like homelessness, domestic violence and incarceration. In addition, there are around 230 recognised Indigenous languages in Australia, so English is not number one. There is a lower life expectancy for people of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander heritage. Excuse me. And it's important to respect and understand cultural norms. For example, the kinship structures. I met a lady in Lockhart River who was raising her grandson as her child and another girl whose uncle was raised as her brother. It was almost slightly embarrassing that they were explaining to me that that wasn't how I would know it, but that was exactly how they believed it. So back in Brisbane, after the trip to Lockhart River, apart from processing all the forms we were given, which involved working with 3 other super funds, LGIA Super, AMP and Sun Super, all who were really good in getting these forms processed, we decided to have a closer look at our members, communities in our members in communities of far north Queensland. Immediately we found we had 200 duplicate records that we could combine. And then we started looking at our lost accounts, both ones that we held and ones that the ATO held. We got help from the federal and state electoral offices for new addresses. We got help from the birth, deaths and marriages people, because it turned out a lot of those people had actually passed. We then started contacting various members in the community. We contacted just about anybody: police, doctors, the health services, elders, community groups, anyone, because people will help you when you ring. And so far we've reunited 148 people with over $3.2 million, and we've paid out $2.5 million to family of 26 members who had passed away. And some of them had passed away a while ago, so yes, thank you, we're very proud of that. Yeah. When we went back to Brisbane, we also met with some of our local members who identify as Indigenous and asked them how they felt about QSuper, including a relative of Gordon Tallis, anyone who knows Queensland football. Apart from confirming a lot of things we saw in LOCKHART River were the same in the city, like the kinship issues, we were told that our member centres and written communication weren't inviting. Since then, we now focus on ensuring diversity in the photos we use in our publications, and we've commissioned artwork from local artists and placed them in our offices. So just show you some of those because they're quite lovely. That's in Cairns, the brown dolphins in the middle. And these ones are in our Gold Coast offices. Anyone recognise Migaloo over there near the Gold Coast skyline, and the serpent near the hinterland? We also finalised our Reconciliation Action Plan and commissioned some artwork to go with that. And this is, I think, quite lovely. I will have to tell you what it means because I think it's impressive. It also tells the story of QSuper. The central flower, that is our member. Our members. The flowers around the outside recommend there's a Banksia. It's from the top looking down. There's a Banksia, which is the top one over there. It's hard when it's a different. Hang on, I've got a pointer, haven't I?
You got a point over there, though.
Oh, do I? That one there? So that one's our member. That one there's a Banksia. This one's a Frangipani, Cooktown Orchid. So it represents various areas around Queensland, our various regions. The bee here, which is a native bee, look, I'm shaking even on the pointer. The native bee here is a QSuper worker that works through the garden with our members to deliver honey being the health and well-being of our members. Now, all our staff have worker bee buttons, and we have member buttons for our members, and we have a knowledge management tool called the Hive. Ooh, have you heard me then? A management tool called the Hive, which is what the bee goes back to get information to help members. So in summary, what I've realised is that we in this room know our members and our funds better than anyone else, and it's up to us to help our members. In particular, everyone has an identity. We need to work out ways to help our members to satisfy our needs. And we need to understand our members, their environment and their story. Finally, we are the voice of our members when it comes to lobbying for them. The recognition of kinship for binding death nominations is an area where I think we can change and make a really good difference. I know there are ways for us to make the rules work. Use interdependent relationship definition while the child is young, have the member write a will to at least give the board some indication of what the member wants, and you may be able to think of others. And these were the options I gave to the grandmother I met in LOCKHART River, but the point is why? Why do we have to make people fit our rules? To get their money, or in the case to give us direction how they want their death benefit paid? This is an area I'm really passionate about, but I actually felt a bit embarrassed to say to the lady in LOCKHART River that the person she was raising as her child did not meet our definition when he got older. The last thing I'd like to leave you with, before we take any questions, is, as you heard, I appeared at the Royal Commission last year to answer questions about the work QSuper's done in this area. And again, yes, that was Nathan's fault. People often comment to me about how challenging it must have been. And don't get me wrong, it was a challenge, particularly for an introvert like me. But I had a couple of things in my favour. Firstly, it's important to talk about things that need to be done better. And secondly, lots of people, not just at QSuper, but across the industry and beyond, many in this room, the Indigenous Superannuation Working Group, for instance, are trying to make a difference, and that needed to be highlighted. The night before I appeared, I was looking at a spreadsheet with over 70 activities. Actually, one thing you may not realise is you can't take any papers up with you to the Royal Commission. You have to just wing it, which was a bit of a bugger because I had papers like this thick. Anyway, the night before I appeared, I was looking at a spreadsheet with over 70 activities people at QSuper were doing in this area, including the artwork, books for a literacy drive, revising the content of training material, changing our stationery supplier to an Indigenous company. And the best thing was I didn't know about a lot of them. People knew that things had to be done, and they were just making differences and making changes in their own world, not just for our members but for people. What's my last one? Oh yeah, I was sent this slide just after Christmas. If you have children, you may have seen it, which I think sums it all up. In our industry, we pride ourselves on treating our members equally, and I've always and still do believe that. The realisation for me has been that unless everyone starts from the same spot, the results will not be equitable. Thank you.
Pretty amazing, hey? I think this is a beautiful session for us to be closing off our conference with today. There's nothing that says passion for members better than, I think, looking at the people who are disadvantaged in our system. So we don't have a lot of time for questions, and again, that's Nathan's fault. We have 5 minutes though, so the AXA Investment Managers Live Q&A is open. I do have a couple of questions here. So one of those is, what steps should a fund take if it believes an employer has not met their obligations in relation to their ATSI members?
I guess that's probably in terms of providing the correct information on the sheets. I think that that often happens, particularly with Indigenous people. So I know one gentleman's surname is Najala and I've seen it spelt with 1 R, 2 R's, 5 R's across the name. I think that particularly in remote Indigenous communities where people have often got more difficult names to spell phonetically, that it's quite easy for a fund to go back to the employer and to ask them to confirm the person's identity. Often these communities are quite small and have a limited range of employees, and it's quite, you can almost always trace the path back relatively simply to find out that Normie, for example, who worked at the Lockhart River Council, is the only Normie who ever worked at Lockhart River Council, and therefore it is his money. So I think that the first step is to try and contact the employer or to contact other community organisations. I know we've got limited time, so that might be the only question I get to answer. I just wanted to say that both Lyn and Eva, as well as others on the Indigenous Super Working Group, have been real industry leaders in this sector. Before Eva was chair of AIST, she was involved in the working group in the establishment of it. Lyn didn't realise there was any issues for Indigenous members until we took her to Lockhart River, and since then she's been like a dog at a bone. This issue, I don't think anyone who's ever met Lyn in this room would have walked away without having her ask them what you're doing for your Indigenous members. So both of these ladies really deserve a lot of credit for the big changes within members.
And just to round that out, we're only here because ASIC gave us the kick up the pants as an industry to begin with. So we've actually got a live question.
Great, thank you. Julia Ingressano from the Finance Sector Union and Australian Super. Nathan, you did a wonderful job in taking us through the some of the outcomes from the recommendations, but I think there was one area that you missed, and that is when Rowena Raw asked you specifically, do you think that there is value in employing more Indigenous people in the financial services sector to actually respond to Indigenous customers and members? And you said yes. And I think for all of us in the room today, thinking about who are we employing and how are we supporting and training up our staff to provide the best cultural advice when we get that type of inquiry, I think is something that we should all be thinking about as funds.
Absolutely, and we were at the Indigenous Super Working Group meeting, I think last week or the week before, and someone said that the latest statistics are that there are only two Indigenous people that are employed in the superannuation industry at the moment. I find that difficult to believe, but it's probably not far from the truth. And if there are only two Indigenous people across the entire superannuation system, then that is something that your industry can really work on and make a big difference.
Can I just add something to that? I totally support employing more Indigenous people, don't get me wrong, but I also think we're incumbent upon us as Superannuation Fund people to know all our members and not to just say, oh, it's okay, we've got an Indigenous person working for us, they can handle all the Indigenous inquiries. And I know that's not what you're saying, but I think it's up to us to know all our members, know their stories and solve their problems as well.
Yeah, and actually, if I can have my last slide, we are holding another Indigenous Summit this year, so I hope that you will all be there and bring colleagues along with you, and there will be a session at that summit on Indigenous employment. So we do need to do more. Our understanding is that we have 2 Indigenous trustee directors and 2 employees in a system that employs over 5,000 people.
And there's one of them. There was a question.
Question.
Thanks very much for this forum. My name's Madeline, I'm from Cbus Super. How can super funds become better educated about Indigenous culture, and how do Indigenous people, how would they like to see that look?
Look, even just talking to your Indigenous members, invite one of them in, like Lyn said, to have a meeting with you or with your fund. Obviously, don't start with getting them to do a presentation at something like in front of large numbers of your staff, but having a cup of coffee and sitting down is a really good first step. But there are also great organisations that run cultural awareness training, and including some of the interpreter services. I've seen some of the interpreter services run really excellent cultural awareness training that even opens my eyes to the way that we need to speak to Indigenous members. For example, I went to a session for some of ASIC's investigators a few weeks ago in Darwin, and the interpreter service, two of the blokes came and they spoke to each other in their own language for about a minute, and then they asked us, what did you understand from that? And we understood basically nothing. Then they told us the meaning of about half of the words and spoke to each other again and asked us what we understood. And again, it was very little. We could understand dog, vet, road, car, but it was very difficult to know whether or not what they were actually talking about. And so it really reminded me of the importance when we're speaking to people for whom English is not a first language, of making sure that we confirm their understanding of what we're saying. So yeah, I think cultural awareness trainers, which there are companies that run cultural awareness, but there are also the interpreter services do it really well as well.
And if I can answer that as well, in Queensland we have a group called the LOCKHART Training People, and that's exactly what they do, cultural awareness training, and they also take us on cultural walks around Brisbane to show us sites. But the other thing that's really helpful is just talking to your staff. We have regional offices. Are you Australian Cbus? You said Cbus? Yeah. You've got offices all around the country. You probably find people are dealing with Indigenous people all the time. And as soon as people start sharing the stories of the problems members are having, I'm finding everyone wants to help. Everyone wants to find a solution. So if you talk to your staff about what your members are actually finding, you'll find it'll just bubble over.
For those of you in Melbourne, AIST has used the Koori Heritage Centre to do our sensitivity training, and also to do walks around Melbourne to understand its history. It's a beautiful way of actually bringing people in and making them feel included on the journey for trying to improve outcomes for Indigenous people. Unfortunately, we are well and truly out of time, but I think both Nathan's fault. But both Nathan and Lyn are around for you to talk to for a little while if you would like. Please fill out the feedback on the CMSF app. We'd really like your feedback on this session. I think it's probably clear that 45 minutes to talk about these issues is not long enough, so please put that in your feedback so we do better next year, because they don't listen to me back at the office. As you know, we thank our speakers at this conference for their contribution with their donation to First Nations Foundation, and it's fabulous to have Amanda Young, their CEO, in the room with us today. And if you haven't had a chance to talk to Amanda, I'd encourage you to do that as well. Morning tea is now served in CMSF Central, and I have no more raffle to plug, so thank you.